A poor boy in rural Mississippi left his only piece of bread in front of a statue of the Virgin Mary at the local Catholic church. The next morning, the entire town was searching for him, because that bread had become something impossible to explain. The Mississippi Delta heat was suffocating that July afternoon in 2018 when 8-year-old Tommy Williams walked the 2 miles from his trailer park to downtown Clarksdale, clutching the last piece of white bread his family had in the house. Tommy lived with his grandmother, Ruby Williams, in a rusted single-wide trailer that had seen better days sometime in the 1980s. Ruby worked 2 jobs, cleaning houses during the day and stocking shelves at the Dollar General at night, but it was never enough to keep food on the table consistently. "Baby," she told Tommy that morning, her weathered hands shaking as she handed him the slice of Wonder Bread, "this is all we got till I get paid Friday. You make sure you eat every crumb, you hear?" Tommy had nodded solemnly, understanding even at 8 years old that when Grandma Ruby gave you the last of something, it meant she wasn't eating at all. But as he walked down Sunflower Avenue past the abandoned cotton warehouses and boarded-up storefronts that told the story of Clarksdale's economic decline, Tommy wasn't thinking about his empty stomach. He was thinking about the statue he'd discovered 3 weeks ago. St. Mary's Catholic Church sat on the corner of 3rd Street and Yazoo Avenue, a modest brick building that served the small but faithful congregation of about 40 families. Most of Clarksdale was Baptist or Methodist, with a handful of Pentecostal churches scattered throughout the predominantly African American community. The Catholic Church was an anomaly, attended mostly by the few Hispanic families who had moved to the Delta seeking agricultural work. Tommy had stumbled upon St. Mary's purely by accident. He'd been running from some older boys who'd been throwing rocks at him for being trailer trash when he ducked into the unlocked church to hide. That's when he saw her. The statue of Our Lady of Perpetual Help stood in a small alcove to the left of the altar, about 4 feet tall, with painted robes of deep blue and gold. Her face was serene but sorrowful, her hands extended in a gesture of welcome and protection. Fresh flowers surrounded the statue, marigolds and roses that someone had carefully arranged despite the church's obvious financial struggles. But what had captivated Tommy wasn't the statue's beauty, it was her eyes. The painted eyes seemed to follow him as he moved through the church, not in a frightening way, but with the kind of gentle attention he rarely received from adults in his young life. "You hungry too?" he had whispered to the statue that first day, somehow sensing a kindness there that made conversation feel natural. Since then, Tommy had been returning to St. Mary's whenever he could slip away unnoticed. He would sit in the back pew and tell the statue about his day, about Grandma Ruby's tired face when she came home from work, about the kids at school who made fun of his clothes, about the gnawing emptiness in his stomach that had become his constant companion. The church was always empty during his visits. Father Martinez, the young priest who served 3 parishes across the Delta, was rarely there except for Sunday Mass and evening services. Tommy had the sanctuary to himself, and the silent presence of the Virgin Mary, who seemed to listen without judgment. Today, however, was different. Today Tommy had made a decision that would change everything. He pushed open the heavy wooden doors of St. Mary's and walked down the center aisle, his bare feet silent on the worn carpet. The afternoon sun streamed through the simple stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the floor. Tommy approached the statue with the same reverence he'd developed over his weeks of visits. He knelt on the small prayer kneeler that someone had placed before the alcove and carefully unwrapped the slice of bread from the paper towel Grandma Ruby had given him. "Mary," he said softly, using the familiar name he'd adopted for the statue, "I know you got a little boy too, Jesus. And I bet sometimes he gets hungry just like me." Tommy held up the slice of bread, examining it in the colored light filtering through the windows. It wasn't much store-brand white bread, a little stale, with one corner slightly moldy that he'd carefully torn away. But it was all he had. Grandma Ruby says when you love somebody, you share what you got, even if it ain't much. And I figure you love everybody, right? Even kids like me from the trailer park." He placed the bread carefully at the base of the statue, arranging it on the paper towel like an offering. The gesture felt right, though he couldn't have explained why to anyone who might have asked. "I ain't eaten since yesterday," Tommy continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I reckon Jesus might be hungry too. So this is for him. Tell him it's from Tommy Williams, and I hope it tastes better to him than it would to me." Tommy remained kneeling for several more minutes, feeling a strange peace wash over him despite his empty stomach. There was something about the statue's painted face that seemed different today, warmer somehow, as though she were pleased with his offering. "I better go," he finally said. "Grandma Ruby will be wondering where I got to." Tommy stood and walked back down the aisle, leaving his only food at the feet of the Virgin Mary. As he reached the door, he turned back one more time to look at the statue. For just a moment, he could have sworn he saw her painted lips curve into the slightest smile. But that was impossible, he told himself. Statues don't smile. The walk home felt longer than usual, and by the time Tommy reached the trailer park, his stomach was cramping with hunger. Ruby wouldn't be home from her day job for another 2 hours, and her evening shift at Dollar General would keep her out until midnight. Tommy spent the rest of the afternoon trying to distract himself from his hunger by reading one of the 3 books he owned, a tattered copy of Where the Red Fern Grows that a teacher had given him at the end of the school year. But the words kept blurring together as his body reminded him that he hadn't eaten in over 24 hours. When Ruby finally came home around 6 p.m., she found Tommy lying on the old couch, pale and listless. "Baby, did you eat that bread I gave you?" she asked, concern immediately creasing her lined face. Tommy hesitated. He'd never lied to Grandma Ruby, but he also couldn't explain what he'd done without sounding crazy. I gave it to someone who needed it more," he said finally. Ruby sat down heavily beside him, her uniform from the cleaning service still damp with sweat. "Tommy, honey, what do you mean? There wasn't nobody around here who needed it more than you." "There was, Grandma. I promise there was." Ruby studied her grandson's face, seeing the honesty there but also the obvious effects of prolonged hunger. His cheeks were hollow, his lips pale, and there were dark circles under his eyes that no 8-year-old should have. "Well," she said finally, "I suppose that's what Jesus would have done. But baby, we got to figure out something for tonight. I don't get paid till Friday, and—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Tommy understood. They had no money, no food, and no prospects until Ruby's paycheck arrived in 2 days. "It's okay, Grandma," Tommy said, though his stomach chose that moment to growl audibly. "We'll be all right." That night, Tommy lay on his narrow cot in the trailer's single bedroom, listening to his grandmother toss and turn on the fold-out couch in the living room. He knew she was awake, probably praying and worrying about how to feed them both. Tommy found himself praying too, something he'd never done much before discovering the statue at St. Mary's. "Mary," he whispered into the darkness, "I don't know if what I did was right. Grandma Ruby says I should have eaten that bread, but it felt like you wanted me to give it to Jesus. If I messed up, I'm sorry. And if you could maybe help us figure out what to do about food, I'd sure appreciate it." Tommy fell asleep still whispering prayers to the Virgin Mary, unaware that his simple act of faith was about to set in motion events that would transform not just his life, but the entire community of Clarksdale. The next morning dawned bright and clear, with the oppressive humidity that characterized Mississippi summers. Tommy woke early, around 6 a.m., and decided to walk to St. Mary's before the day got too hot. He wanted to see if his bread offering was still there, though he wasn't sure why that mattered to him. The streets of Clarksdale were quiet at that hour, with only a few early commuters heading to work at the remaining businesses that kept the town economically afloat. Tommy made his way through the familiar neighborhoods, past houses that ranged from well-maintained to abandoned, reflecting the economic diversity of a community that had seen better days. When he reached St. Mary's, Tommy was surprised to find the front doors standing wide open. Soft lights spilled out onto the sidewalk, and he could hear voices inside. Multiple voices, speaking in excited whispers. Tommy hesitated at the entrance. He'd never encountered anyone else during his visits to the church, and he wasn't sure if he was supposed to be there. But curiosity won over caution, and he stepped quietly inside. What he saw took his breath away. The small sanctuary was filled with people, more people than Tommy had ever seen in St. Mary's. There were the Hispanic families he recognized from the neighborhood, but also faces he didn't know. Father Martinez was there, still in his pajamas under a hastily thrown-on jacket, kneeling before the statue of Our Lady of Perpetual Help. But it wasn't the crowd that made Tommy gasp. It was what they were all staring at. The slice of bread he had left at the statue's feet was still there, but it was no longer just bread. It was glowing with a soft, warm light that seemed to emanate from within. The paper towel beneath it was untouched, but the bread itself appeared to be alive somehow, pulsing gently with an inner radiance that filled the entire alcove with golden illumination. "Dios mío," whispered an elderly Hispanic woman, crossing herself repeatedly. "Es un milagro." Father Martinez looked up from his prayers and noticed Tommy standing frozen in the doorway. The priest was young, probably in his early 30s, with kind eyes that immediately focused on the boy with recognition rather than surprise. "You," Father Martinez said softly, rising to his feet. "You're the one who left this offering, aren't you?" Tommy nodded mutely, afraid he was in trouble but unable to look away from the glowing bread. "What's your name, son?" "Tommy Williams, sir." "Tommy, can you tell us why you brought this bread to Our Lady?" Tommy glanced around at all the faces watching him, feeling overwhelmed by the attention. I was hungry, but I figured Jesus might be hungry too. So I gave him my bread instead of eating it myself." A murmur went through the crowd. Several people wiped tears from their eyes. "And when did you leave this offering?" Father Martinez asked gently. "Yesterday afternoon. Right after I got here from walking." Father Martinez turned back to the statue, his voice filled with awe. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we're witnessing here appears to be a Eucharistic miracle. This bread, offered by a child in pure faith and self-sacrifice, has been transformed by God into something sacred." An older African-American woman Tommy didn't recognize stepped forward. "Father, I've been coming to check on this church every morning for 10 years, making sure nobody broke in during the night. When I got here at 5:30 this morning, that bread was glowing so bright I thought the building was on fire. I called everyone I could think of. Mrs. Washington has been a faithful guardian of our church for years," Father Martinez explained to Tommy. "She's the one who discovered the miracle." Tommy stared at the bread, trying to process what was happening. Is Jesus really there? In my bread?" Father Martinez knelt down to Tommy's eye level. "Tommy, what you've done is one of the purest acts of faith I've ever witnessed. You gave everything you had to Jesus, even when it meant going hungry yourself. And God has chosen to honor that sacrifice in a miraculous way." "But I don't understand. It was just regular bread from the store." "Sometimes, Tommy, God uses the simplest things to show us His greatest love. Your bread has become a sign that He sees every sacrifice, no matter how small, and that He honors the faith of children in special ways." As word of the miracle spread throughout the morning, more and more people arrived at St. Mary's. News traveled fast in a small town like Clarksdale, and by noon the little church was overflowing with visitors, Catholics and Protestants alike, drawn by curiosity and wonder. Tommy found himself at the center of attention in a way that made him deeply uncomfortable. People wanted to touch him, to hear the story over and over again, to understand how an 8-year-old boy had somehow triggered a miracle. But what amazed him most was how the adults looked at him now. Instead of the dismissive glances or pitying looks he was used to receiving as that poor kid from the trailer park, people were looking at him with something approaching reverence. "Tommy Williams," said Mayor Johnson, who had arrived with a small entourage around 1 p.m. "Son, you've put Clarksdale on the map. This is the kind of thing that brings tourists, brings attention, brings economic development." Tommy didn't understand most of what the mayor was saying, but he did understand that somehow his simple act of sharing had become something much bigger than he'd intended. Father Martinez seemed to sense his discomfort. "Tommy, would you like to step outside for a moment? Get some fresh air?" Tommy nodded gratefully, and the priest led him out through a side door into the small garden behind the church. "This is a lot for anyone to handle," Father Martinez said kindly. "Especially someone your age." "Father, did I do something wrong? I just wanted to give Jesus my bread." "You did nothing wrong, Tommy. In fact, you did something beautifully right. But I want you to understand that what happened here isn't really about the bread. It's about your heart." "I don't understand." "You were hungry, really hungry, but you chose to give what little you had to someone you believed needed it more. That kind of selfless love is what Jesus wants from all of us. The miracle isn't just the glowing bread, Tommy. The miracle is your generous heart." As they talked, Tommy heard a familiar voice calling his name from the front of the church. "Tommy. Tommy Williams. Where are you, baby?" It was Grandma Ruby, and she sounded frantic. Tommy ran around to the front of the church with Father Martinez close behind, and found Grandma Ruby standing at the edge of the crowd, her eyes wide with panic and confusion. She was still wearing her Dollar General uniform from the night shift, having come straight from work after hearing the news. "Tommy!" she cried when she spotted him, rushing forward to pull him into a fierce embrace. "Baby, what have you gotten yourself into? People are saying, they're saying you made some kind of miracle happen." Tommy hugged his grandmother tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of her perfume mixed with the industrial soap from her cleaning jobs. In all the excitement and confusion of the morning, he'd forgotten that someone would eventually tell Ruby what had happened. "Grandma, I can explain." "Ma'am," Father Martinez interrupted gently. "You must be Tommy's grandmother." "I'm Father Martinez from St. Mary's. Would you like to come inside and see what your grandson has done?" Ruby looked skeptically at the young priest, then at the crowd of people still gathered around the church entrance. "I don't know what kind of Catholic nonsense this is, but Tommy is Baptist. We don't believe in—" "Grandma," Tommy said quietly, "please just come look. You don't have to believe anything. Just look." Something in her grandson's voice made Ruby pause. She'd raised Tommy since he was 3 years old, after his mother died in a car accident and his father disappeared. In all that time, she'd never heard him speak with such quiet conviction. "All right," she said finally. "But just for a minute." Father Martinez led them through the crowd, which parted respectfully as people recognized Tommy. When they reached the alcove where the statue of Our Lady of Perpetual Help stood, Ruby gasped audibly. The bread was still glowing, perhaps even more brightly than before. The golden light seemed to pulse gently, casting warm reflections on the faces of everyone gathered around it. The paper towel beneath it remained completely ordinary, making the supernatural nature of the bread's transformation even more pronounced. "Jesus," Ruby whispered, then caught herself. "I mean, Lord have mercy. What is that?" "That's the bread I gave to Mary yesterday," Tommy said simply. "The bread you gave me for breakfast." Ruby stared at her grandson, then at the glowing bread, then back at Tommy. "Baby, what are you saying?" "I was hungry, Grandma, but I kept thinking about how Mary's boy Jesus probably gets hungry sometimes too. So I brought my bread here and left it for him. And now it's different." "Mrs. Williams," Father Martinez said softly, "your grandson performed an act of pure faith yesterday. He gave away his only food to help someone he believed was in need. What you're seeing here appears to be God's response to that selfless love." Ruby was quiet for a long moment, studying the miraculous bread. "Father, I've been Baptist my whole life. I don't know nothing about Catholic ways. But I do know my grandson, and if Tommy says he gave his food away to help somebody, then that's exactly what he did." She knelt down and put her hands on Tommy's shoulders. "Baby, you mean to tell me you've been going hungry because you've been giving your food away?" Tommy nodded, suddenly feeling ashamed. "I'm sorry, Grandma. I know you work real hard to get us food, and I probably shouldn't have." "Hush," Ruby said, pulling him close again. "Don't you apologize for having a generous heart. That's the most beautiful thing I ever heard." As they stood there, a commotion arose near the church entrance. A local news crew had arrived from Jackson, having caught wind of the story through social media posts from the morning's visitors. "Oh Lord," Ruby muttered. "This is about to get real complicated." Father Martinez seemed to share her concern. "Mrs. Williams, Tommy, would you like to come to my office? We can talk privately about how to handle all this attention." They made their way through the crowd to the small office behind the sanctuary, where Father Martinez closed the door and offered them chairs. The office was modest, a simple desk, some theological books, a small cross on the wall, but it felt like a refuge from the chaos outside. "Tommy," the priest said, "I need to ask you something important. Some people are going to want to touch the bread, to take pictures, maybe even to take pieces of it home with them. How do you feel about that?" Tommy considered the question seriously. "Well, if it's really Jesus in there like you said, then I guess people should be able to visit him. But it feels wrong to break it up. Like it should stay whole." "That shows great wisdom," Father Martinez said. "Mrs. Williams, I want you to know that the Catholic Church takes these kinds of events very seriously. If this is indeed a genuine miracle, there will be an investigation, probably visits from officials in the diocese, maybe even media attention from much further away than Jackson." Ruby looked overwhelmed. "Father, we're just poor folks trying to get by. We don't know nothing about dealing with church officials and reporters and such." "I understand completely. And I want you to know that St. Mary's will do everything we can to protect Tommy and your family's privacy. But I also think you should be prepared for your lives to change significantly." As if to emphasize his point, a knock came at the office door. Father Martinez opened it to find a well-dressed African-American woman in her 50s, accompanied by two men in suits. "Father Martinez," the woman said. "I'm Dr. Sarah Washington from the University of Mississippi Medical Center. These gentlemen are from the diocesan office in Jackson. We'd like to speak with you about the reported miracle." Father Martinez glanced back at Ruby and Tommy. "Of course. Please come in." Dr. Washington introduced herself as a professor of biochemistry who also served on the Church's commission for investigating reported miracles. The two men were Father Thompson, the diocesan chancellor, and Mr. Roberts, a lay investigator who specialized in documenting unexplained phenomena. "We've been examining the bread for the past hour," Dr. Washington explained. "While we'll need to conduct extensive laboratory testing to draw any definitive conclusions, I can tell you that what we're observing appears to have no natural explanation. The luminescence isn't being generated by any external source we can identify," added Mr. Roberts. "There's no electrical equipment, no chemical phosphorescence, no trick photography. The light genuinely appears to be emanating from within the bread itself." Father Thompson, an older priest with graying hair and kind eyes, focused his attention on Tommy. "Son, can you tell me exactly what you were thinking when you left your bread here yesterday?" Tommy repeated his story once again, explaining about his visits to the church, his hunger, and his decision to give his food to Jesus. Father Thompson listened carefully, occasionally asking clarifying questions but never in a way that made Tommy feel like he was being interrogated. "Tommy," Father Thompson said when the boy finished, "what you did is called an act of sacrifice. You gave up something you needed because you believed someone else needed it more. That's exactly what Jesus did for all of us." "But I just gave him bread," Tommy said. "Jesus gave up his whole life. And that," Father Thompson smiled, "is why God chose to honor your gift in such a special way. You understood, even as young as you are, what it means to love others more than yourself." Dr. Washington had been taking notes throughout the conversation. "Mrs. Williams, with your permission, we'd like to conduct some medical tests on Tommy as well. Nothing invasive," she added quickly, seeing Ruby's alarmed expression. "Just some basic examinations to document his health status and make sure he's suffering no ill effects from his experience." "What kind of tests?" Ruby asked suspiciously. "Blood work, basic physical exam, maybe some psychological evaluation to assess his mental state. All completely routine and painless." Ruby looked at Tommy, who shrugged. "I guess that's okay, Grandma." "All right then. But I'm staying with him the whole time." "Of course." As the afternoon wore on, Tommy found himself subjected to a battery of tests and interviews. Dr. Washington drew blood samples that she said would be sent to laboratories in 3 different states for independent analysis. Father Thompson conducted what he called a spiritual interview, asking Tommy about his prayer life, his understanding of God, and his motivations for visiting St. Mary's. Most surprisingly to Tommy, the psychological evaluator, a kind woman named Dr. Martinez, no relation to Father Martinez, seemed less interested in whether he was telling the truth than in how he was coping with suddenly being the center of so much attention. "Tommy," she asked during their private session, "how do you feel about all these people wanting to talk to you and examine you?" "It's kind of scary," Tommy admitted. "I just wanted to help Jesus when he was hungry. I didn't know it would turn into such a big deal." "Do you feel pressure to say certain things or act in certain ways because of what people expect?" Tommy thought about that. "Not really. Everybody's been real nice. But I wish they'd understand that I didn't do nothing special. I just shared my food." "And that doesn't feel special to you?" "No, ma'am. Grandma Ruby always taught me to share what I got. It's just what you're supposed to do." Dr. Martinez made some notes. "Tommy, you seem like a very well-adjusted young man with a clear sense of right and wrong. I'm going to recommend that you continue your normal routine as much as possible, despite all this attention." Meanwhile, outside the church, the crowd had grown throughout the day. By evening, there were several hundred people gathered on 3rd Street, creating traffic jams and overwhelming the small neighborhood. Food trucks had appeared, along with vendors selling religious items and T-shirts that someone had hastily printed with slogans like, "Clarksdale Miracle," and "Tommy's Bread." Mayor Johnson was in his element, giving interviews to every news outlet that arrived and talking about the economic benefits the miracle would bring to the struggling town. But Father Martinez was becoming increasingly concerned about the circus atmosphere developing around what should have been a sacred event. "Mrs. Williams," he said as the official interviews concluded. "I think it might be best if you and Tommy went home for the evening. This crowd isn't going to disperse anytime soon, and Tommy needs rest." Ruby agreed readily. The day had been overwhelming for all of them, and she could see the exhaustion in her grandson's face. As they prepared to leave through the back door of the church, Father Thompson approached them with an envelope. "Mrs. Williams," he said quietly, "the diocese wants to do something for Tommy's family. This isn't payment for anything, and it comes with no strings attached. It's simply our way of acknowledging the sacrifice your family has made and the blessing you've brought to our community." Ruby opened the envelope and gasped. Inside was a check for $5,000. "Father, we can't accept this. We didn't do nothing to deserve." "Mrs. Williams," Father Thompson interrupted gently, "your grandson gave away his last piece of food when he was hungry. The least we can do is make sure he never has to go hungry again." Ruby's eyes filled with tears. I don't know what to say." "Say you'll let us help," Father Martinez added. "And say you'll bring Tommy back to visit us, even when all this excitement dies down." "Course we will," Ruby said, looking at Tommy. "Won't we, baby?" Tommy nodded, then walked over to the alcove where his bread still glowed softly in the evening light. The crowd outside had thinned somewhat, but there were still dozens of people keeping vigil, praying and singing hymns. "Mary," he whispered to the statue, "thank you for taking care of me and Grandma Ruby. And thank you for letting Jesus like my bread." As they walked home through the darkening streets of Clarksdale, Ruby put her arm around Tommy's shoulders. "Baby," she said, "you know this is gonna change things for us, don't you?" "I know, Grandma. But you always told me that when God blesses you, you're supposed to use those blessings to help other people." Ruby smiled, thinking about the check in her purse that would pay their rent for months and put food on their table consistently for the first time in years. "That's right, baby. And I think we're gonna have lots of opportunities to help people now." Over the following weeks, the miracle of Tommy's bread drew visitors from across the country. The glowing never faded, and scientific tests continued to find no natural explanation for the phenomenon. The bread showed no signs of decay or decomposition, remaining exactly as it had been when Tommy first left it at the statue's feet. More importantly for the local community, the influx of pilgrims and tourists brought economic revitalization to Clarksdale. New restaurants opened, old buildings were renovated, and unemployment dropped significantly as businesses expanded to serve the growing number of visitors. Tommy and Ruby moved out of the trailer park into a modest house that the diocese helped them purchase. Ruby was able to quit her night job and focus on her day work, while Tommy continued attending the same school and living much the same life as before, though with considerably more food security. The Catholic Church officially recognized the miracle 6 months later, after extensive investigation by Vatican officials. St. Mary's was designated as a shrine, and Tommy's bread was placed in a specially designed reliquary where it continues to glow to this day. But perhaps the most significant change was in Tommy himself. While he remained the same generous, thoughtful child he'd always been, he now carried himself with a quiet confidence that came from knowing God had used his simple act of faith to touch countless lives. "I still don't really understand why God picked me," he told a reporter on the first anniversary of the miracle. "But Grandma Ruby says sometimes God uses little things to do big things. I guess my bread was little enough for God to make it into something big." Today, 10 years later, Tommy Williams is a senior in high school with plans to study theology in college. He still visits St. Mary's regularly, not as a celebrity or the subject of miraculous attention, but simply as a young man who maintains a close relationship with the Virgin Mary who first listened to his childhood prayers. The bread continues to glow in its reliquary, drawing thousands of visitors each year to the small church in Clarksdale, Mississippi. And while many come seeking miracles of their own, what they often find instead is the more profound truth that Tommy discovered as an 8-year-old boy. That God sees every act of selfless love, no matter how small, and honors the generous heart above all else. Because sometimes the greatest miracles aren't the supernatural signs that capture headlines, but the simple human capacity to give what we have to those we believe need it more, even when what we have is our last piece of bread, and we're going hungry ourselves. And there you have it. This incredible story of childhood faith and divine response touched your heart, didn't it? Tommy proved that when we give everything we have to Jesus, even our last piece of bread when we're starving, the Virgin Mary makes sure that sacrifice is honored in miraculous ways, right? If you were moved by this real testimony of how an 8-year-old boy from Mississippi gave his only food to a statue of the Virgin Mary, and God transformed that bread into a glowing miracle that saved an entire town, hit that like button below. It really helps me continue sharing these stories that show how Mary intercedes for the innocent and faithful. If you're not subscribed yet, subscribe now and hit that notification bell. Every week there's a new testimony that will renew your faith that the Virgin Mary sees every sacrifice, no matter how small, and brings our offerings directly to her Son Jesus. And don't forget to check out our store in the first pinned comment. We have amazing Christian products, including the 365-day Devotional, perfect for strengthening your childlike faith and understanding Mary's role in presenting our gifts to Christ. Tell us in the comments. Have you ever given something precious when you had very little? Do you believe the Virgin Mary presents our sacrifices to Jesus? And if you also believe in the power of innocent faith and sacrificial giving, write, Mary presents our gifts. Declare your trust in her maternal intercession. Share this video with families struggling financially, with parents teaching children about generosity, with anyone who needs to see that God honors every sacrifice made with pure love, especially from children. Thanks for watching until the end. May the Virgin Mary bless your generous heart and help you give like little Tommy, with complete trust that she will present your offerings to Jesus. See you in the next testimony.